In this short video, I'm going to talk about syntax, specifically the principles and parameters theory. The principles and parameters theory was developed by Chomsky in the 1980s and 90s, linguist Noam Chomsky. And it's a theoretical model which Radford explains maintains the universal properties of natural language grammars reflect the operation of a set of universal grammatical principles, and that grammatical differences between languages can be characterized in terms of a restricted set of parameters. So there we've got the principles and parameters. The universal properties reflect the universal grammatical principles, and the differences between languages can be described as the parameters. This is to say that the things all natural languages have in common exist because the innate language processing ability we are born with is constrained by a set of grammatical principles. The language ability we're born with follows certain rules, therefore all natural languages follow certain rules. And this is also to say that the differences in grammars between languages reflect a set of parameters, and these parameters are usually either-or choices that each language makes. And we'll discuss what some of these choices are in a minute, but an example would be dropping pronouns. Either you can drop the pronouns in the subject position, or you can't drop the pronoun in the subject position. It's an either-or choice. It's not like you can drop he pronouns but not I pronouns in the subject position. These either-or choices also reflect the innate language processing ability and how it is structured. So these are universal principles that determine the structure of any language, and they need to be able to govern what kinds of operations are possible in any language whatsoever. So these would be principles that determine the structure of English, Japanese, Spanish, and Korean, and they're innate. That is, you're born with them, and therefore they must be universal. Italian babies cannot be born with an innate capacity for Italian. They're born with an innate capacity for language, any language. Okay, the first principle we're going to talk about is the principle of compositionality. It goes basically like this. Sentences are made up of clauses and phrases. Clauses and phrases are made up of smaller clauses and phrases and words. Words can be either lexemes, content words, or have a grammatical capacity, be grammatical morphemes, also known as function words. This describes pretty much any language, ever. Any human language, ever. Here's another one of the principles. This is called the structure dependence principle. Basically, it says that the grammatical operations only apply to certain types of grammatical structures and not others, and that you don't do things with individual words, but with whole categories of words. So to put this another way, the different ways in which we're able to arrange words and phrases depends on whether those words and phrases are nouns or adjectives or prepositions. Prepositional phrases can appear in different parts of sentences than verbs can. Nouns are different than verbs, and we can do different things with verbs than we can with nouns. We can turn the sentence, "They can eat 20 hot dogs," into a question, for example by moving the second word to the front. Can they eat 20 hot dogs? We can't do the same thing with the sentence, "They saw 20 Canadian geese." We can't move the second word to the front and have it read, "Saw they 20 Canadian geese?" That's not grammatical in English. And it's not a matter of being able to move the second word so it's not a matter of being able to move the second word in the sentence, any second word, regardless of the grammatical category, to the front to form a question. We can only move certain types of second words. We can only move certain types of words to the front of the sentence to form a question, those being auxiliaries. We can move auxiliaries to the front to form a question. The structure matters, the grammatical category matters, and this is the structure dependence principle. Grammatical operations only apply to certain types of grammatical structures and not others. Another example of the structure dependence principle is that if you can say Mary loves John, then you can also say John loves Mary. The sentence works as noun verb noun, or subject predicate direct object, with any noun being the subject and any noun being the direct object. The structure applies to the whole category of nouns. We can say fish love the Rolling Stones, even if that seems unlikely. It is grammatically possible, as unlikely as it may be. We can say walls love doors, even if that's semantically odd, it still makes grammatical sense. What's important here is that the structure doesn't just apply to Mary or John, it applies to nouns. Can you think of any language in which it doesn't matter whether something's a verb, a noun, or an adjective? In all languages, what is allowed and not allowed depends on the structure of the sentence. None of us would question this, I think. We probably would agree that it's obvious. It brings us one step closer to describing all languages, though. Another of the principles is the movement and deletion principle. And this principle posits that phrases can be moved and deleted. In English, we use this movement for many purposes, including forming questions or bringing information to focus at the front of a sentence. So how do we know that the language works this way? Well, we can do a substitution test. We can substitute phrases. Sally hated the teacher with the big nose. Mary did too. What did Mary do? She hated the teacher with the big nose. Mary hated him. Who? The teacher with the big nose. Sally hated which teacher? The teacher with the big nose. Who hated the teacher with the big nose? Sally did. Who hated him? Sally hated the teacher with the big nose. So we can substitute phrases with other words. This lets us know that we can move and delete and change and substitute phrases. And again, all languages allow some kind of substitution, some kind of movement and deletion. So principles are a set of general rules that describe what language is. But if the principles were the only thing that determine grammars, then all languages would have basically the same grammar. All languages must follow the same principles, but they differ systematically from each other by following different parameters. Parameters can be thought of as the settings of various different languages. Well, the principles are the requirements that the brain imposes on all languages in order for a language to be a language. The parameters of the universal grammar are the language-specific settings. The range of these settings is limited in some ways, but not in others. Some variation is allowed between languages. All languages vary in a limited range of ways. Now with principles, the innate structure or rule or constraint exists in the universal grammar, and it tells the brain how to interpret linguistic input. This is at birth. The constraint exists. The learner hears the language and interprets it partly through and because they have these principles that tell them language is a certain thing and it allows certain things and it does certain things. With parameters, on the other hand, the parameter needs to be set. So the principle's already set. It only has one setting. The parameter usually has two. It's usually a binary. The learner has to find out, is my language a null subject language or a non-null subject language? These parameters are set through input. The input provides the evidence. The input provides positive evidence and some negative evidence, but some linguists think that only the positive evidence really contributes to parameter setting. Positive evidence would include sentences that contain the phenomena. For example, sentences in which the heads of a phrase come first tells the universal grammar that this is a head-first language, and we'll talk about what a head-first language is in a second. It sounds a bit funny, doesn't it? Negative evidence has two types. Direct negative evidence would be someone saying, we don't do that in this language. For example, if you're speaking English and you drop the subject, as you might in a null subject language. If you said, Paul speaks Italian. If instead of saying Paul speaks Italian, you said speaks Italian. And somebody said, yeah, we need to know who speaks Italian. Are you talking about Paul? That would be direct negative evidence. Somebody actually saying, we don't do that in this language. And we sometimes see this in the second language classroom, but we don't see it as much in natural first language learning in the home. Indirect negative evidence would simply be the lack of something. If you, for example, often hear Koreans saying "먹었어요," which literally means have eaten, but is meant as a question directed at you, so have you eaten, that would be positive evidence that Korean is a null subject language. If you never hear people saying "nonon mokosoyo," meaning "have you eaten," then you now have indirect negative evidence for the same thing. So in short, indirect negative evidence is the thing you don't hear, the structures that no one ever uses. I mentioned that linguists feel only positive evidence, or many linguists feel that only positive evidence contributes to parameter setting. Why doesn't negative evidence contribute? Well, as we mentioned, direct negative evidence such as correction from a parent or a teacher simply isn't frequent enough to be a major factor in language learning. With indirect negative evidence, though, the issue is whether the learner can correctly know that the structure they haven't heard isn't just around the corner. Just because the last 17 people who wanted to invite you out for dinner said mokosoyo, meaning have eaten, doesn't mean that person number 18 isn't going to say nonon mokosoyo, meaning have you eaten. The thing that is not there is not the best evidence. An example of a parameter is the null subject parameter. Some languages allow the subject of finite verbs to be dropped. Some languages do not allow the subject of finite verbs to be dropped. So, an Italian speaker can say Maria parla française and parle française. An English speaker can say Maria speaks French, but not speaks French. Italian is a null subject language. English is a non-null subject language. And this parameter is binary, either non or non-null. Your language either allows you to drop the subject of finite verbs, or it does not allow you to drop the subject of finite verbs. There appear to be no language which allows the subjects of some finite verbs to be null, but not others. So there's no language in which you can drop the subject of speak, but you can't drop the subject of loves. The range of grammatical variation found across languages appears to be strictly limited. There seem to be just these two possibilities. Languages either do or don't systematically allow finite verbs to have null subjects. That's a quote from Radford. The head position parameter is another interesting one. Every phrase in any language has a head word, which determines what kind of phrase it is. So the head word of a noun phrase, for example, is a noun or a pronoun. The head word in a prepositional phrase is a preposition, etc. For example, Korean is head last. So the verb in the verb phrase comes last in the phrase. In a sentence, 닭갈비 먹었어요, the verb is 먹었어요. 닭갈비, a spicy chicken dish, is the noun. And literally it means, have you eaten 닭갈비? Or have you eaten spicy chicken? Notice also that the subject I is understood. Korean's a null subject language. In sentence B, the English sentences, we see the verb phrase ate chicken. The verb ate comes first in the phrase. In some languages, the heads of phrases consistently come first in the phrase. In other languages, the heads consistently come last in the phrase. This again seems to be binary. English is a head first language. Korean is a head last language. Again, this seems to be a binary. English is called head first. The verb phrase close the door begins with close, the verb. Korean is head last. The verb phrase 문을 닫아라 ends with 닫아라, a verb meaning close. These are only a few of the principles and a few of the parameters. There are many more. And this is one of the reasons that the principles and parameters theory has begun to be shunted aside a little. There are so many more principles and parameters that it became difficult to resolve them all as binaries. I do feel it's an extremely productive way of describing languages, though, and I continue to be interested in it.